Imagine this, a decorated black soldier, fresh from serving his country, still in his proud military uniform, suddenly handcuffed and humiliated in the middle of his own hometown, not by enemies abroad, but by the very police officers sworn to protect him. What happens next is shocking, explosive, and unforgettable. And it all changes with just one phone call that cost those officers their jobs. You're watching Brainfuel, the channel where real stories of courage, struggle, and justice come to life. Here, we bring you powerful tales that inspire, challenge, and make you think. If you believe in truth, dignity, and standing tall no matter what, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and fuel your mind with stories that matter. Stop right there. The words ripped to the quiet evening like a gunshot, sharp and commanding, leaving everyone on the street stunned. Two police officers, both white, stormed toward a tall black man standing outside a small-town diner. He wasn't running. He wasn't resisting. He was simply waiting for his order of coffee and pie, enjoying the peace of being back home after months away. His name was Marcus Johnson, and he was wearing his neatly pressed U.S. Army uniform. To the people watching, Marcus looked like the very definition of pride and service. His posture was straight. His medals gleamed under the neon diner lights, and his face carried the quiet strength of someone who had stared danger in the eye overseas. But to the two officers, none of that mattered. They didn't see a soldier. They didn't see a man who had bled for his country. They only saw the color of his skin. Before Marcus could even speak, the officers lunged. One grabbed his left arm and twisted it behind his back. The other slammed him against the hood of their squad car with unnecessary force. Metal clinked as the cold bite of handcuffs locked around his wrists. "Officer, please," Marcus said firmly, his voice calm but commanding, like a man used to giving orders on the battlefield. "You're making a mistake. I serve in the U.S. Army. I am not your suspect." But his words might as well have been whispers in the wind. "Don't try that uniform trick with us." One officer spat, pressing Marcus harder against the car. "We've seen people like you before." The crowd that had gathered outside the diner gasped. A mother shielded her young son's eyes, whispering in disbelief. A group of teenagers pulled out their phones, recording every second. An elderly veteran, himself wearing a faded Navy cap, shook his head furiously and shouted, "That man is one of us. Can't you see his uniform?" But the officers weren't listening. Their eyes were filled with arrogance, their actions dripping with the kind of power that comes when people think they're untouchable. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had faced bullets, bombs, and battlefields where death lurked in every corner, yet this moment cut deeper than all of it. To be treated like a criminal in the country he fought to protect. It was a humiliation no soldier should ever endure. One officer leaned in close and sneered. "You think wearing that uniform makes you special? Not tonight. Tonight, you're just another thug." Those words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed something darker. The officers didn't care who Marcus was. They didn't care about justice or truth. They cared only about feeding their own prejudice. The crowd grew restless. Voices rose in anger. "Let him go," someone shouted. "He hasn't done anything." Another man yelled, "Check his ID. He's a soldier." But the police ignored every plea. Marcus, even with his arms pinned and his body aching from the force, kept his composure. He had been trained in the Army to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly in chaos. Yet this was different. Overseas, the enemy wore uniforms and carried weapons. Here, the enemy wore badges and carried authority. The flashing red and blue lights of the squad car reflected off Marcus's medals, a bitter irony that didn't go unnoticed by the onlookers. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a public stripping of dignity, a moment where a man who had risked his life for his country was reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of those sworn to protect him. The tension thickened. People whispered frantically, debating whether to intervene. Some were too scared, fearing the officers would turn on them. Others felt powerless, their only weapon being the cameras in their hands. A little girl tugged at her father's sleeve and asked in a trembling voice, "Daddy, why are they arresting the soldier? Isn't he one of the good guys?" The father had no answer. He pulled her close, unable to explain a reality that made no sense. Marcus lifted his head slightly, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "Officers, look at me. Look at what I'm wearing. I've served this nation. I've done nothing wrong." But his calmness only seemed to fuel their anger. "Shut up," barked one of the officers, pushing him harder into the car. "You're not the one calling the shots here." Every second felt like an eternity. Marcus's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the deep injustice clawing at his spirit. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every young black man who had ever been treated as guilty before proven innocent. It was about every soldier who came home expecting respect, only to be met with suspicion and hate. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just fighting for his own dignity. He was carrying the weight of countless others who had faced the same cruel fate. The diner's neon sign flickered above, casting a glow over the tense scene. The smell of fried food lingered in the air, mixing with the bitterness of injustice. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more urgent. People knew they were witnessing something wrong, something that would be remembered, something that could not be hidden. And Marcus knew it too. Even as the handcuffs cut into his wrists, even as the officers pushed him down, he reminded himself, "I have faced worse than this. I will not break. I will not give them the satisfaction." He stood tall, even in chains. And though the officers thought they were in control, Marcus had a quiet certainty inside him. This moment would not define him. It would expose them, because heroes don't stay silent forever. And sometimes all it takes is the right moment, the right call to change everything. Marcus Johnson stood handcuffed in the middle of the street, his wrists bound tightly behind him, the metal cutting into his skin. The world seemed to slow down around him. The flashing red and blue lights painted his uniform in streaks of color, turning his proud military appearance into something grotesque. A decorated soldier made to look like a criminal. The humiliation wasn't just in the cuffs or the rough treatment. It was in the way the officers looked at him, like he was beneath them, like his service, his sacrifice, his very humanity meant nothing. The crowd had grown larger now. Dozens of people lined the sidewalk, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Phones were held high, recording every moment, live streams buzzing across social media. Strangers who had never met Marcus were now silent witnesses to an injustice unfolding before their eyes. Some in the crowd couldn't hold back their outrage. "Are you blind? He's in uniform," one man shouted, pointing angrily at Marcus's medals. Another woman cried out, "That's a soldier. He just came back home. What's wrong with you people?" But the officers brushed off the outcry with cold arrogance. One of them smirked at the crowd and barked, "Stay back if you don't want trouble." His words weren't just a warning. They were a threat, a reminder of the power he thought he had over everyone standing there. Marcus lifted his head, scanning the crowd. He saw a mixture of anger, sadness, and helplessness. Then his eyes landed on a group of young boys, no older than 12, watching silently, their faces frozen in fear. He saw himself in them, decades ago, when he too had looked at the world with innocent eyes. What lesson were they learning now? That no matter how much you give, no matter what uniform you wear, some people will still see you only through the color of your skin. That thought cut him deeper than the steel cuffs ever could. One officer, clearly enjoying the moment, leaned close to Marcus's ear and sneered, "Do you think this uniform makes you untouchable? You people always think you can get away with anything." Marcus clenched his jaw. The words burned, not because they were true, but because they exposed the poison in the officer's heart. He had fought wars overseas, faced enemies who wanted to destroy freedom itself. Yet here, in the middle of his own hometown, he was facing an enemy far more insidious: racism wearing a badge. The humiliation grew heavier with each passing second. For Marcus, this wasn't just personal, it was public. Every person on that street, every camera lens, every live stream viewer was seeing him not as the soldier he was, but as a man shackled like a criminal. The crowd began to murmur louder. An elderly veteran, his navy cap tilted low, stepped forward, his voice trembling with rage. "You dishonor every man and woman who ever wore that uniform. That man has bled for this country. And you," he pointed a shaking finger at the officers, "you spit on his service." But instead of shame, the officers laughed. One of them barked back, "Mind your own business. "Old man, before we arrest you too." The crowd erupted in boos and shouts, but still, no one dared step too close. The line between protest and arrest was razor thin, and everyone knew it. For Marcus, the humiliation wasn't just in the way he was treated, but in the helplessness of the moment. He had commanded soldiers in war zones, made split-second decisions that saved lives. Yet here he was powerless against the very people sworn to protect him. A mother pulled her teenage son closer to her side, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. But he could see the boy's face, twisted with anger and confusion. That boy was learning a lesson no school could teach, that justice in America was not always blind, and dignity could be stripped away in an instant. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He refused to let the officers break his spirit. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. Even with chains around his wrists, he stood as tall as he could, his back straight, his eyes unwavering. The humiliation was sharp, but his pride was sharper. And yet, inside, he felt the weight of betrayal. He had stood in deserts under burning suns, marched through foreign villages filled with danger, and fought for freedoms many took for granted. He had returned home expecting respect, or, at the very least, fairness. Instead, he was being paraded like a criminal in front of his community. Every sneer from the officers, every mocking laugh, every dismissive shove, it wasn't just directed at Marcus. It was an insult to every soldier who had ever fought for the flag stitched to his sleeve. The crowd began chanting now. "Let him go! Let him go!" The voices grew louder, echoing off the diner walls, shaking the officers' false sense of control. Still, they held firm, as if determined to prove they had the upper hand. But Marcus knew something they didn't. He knew that humiliation, while painful, was not permanent. Dignity could be stripped away temporarily, but truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface. He reminded himself silently, this will not end here. Justice always finds a way. For the moment, however, he endured, shackled, humiliated, watched by dozens of eyes and thousands more online. A soldier in uniform, treated as less than human by those who had sworn an oath to uphold the law. The irony was suffocating. Overseas, Marcus had fought against enemies who tried to suppress freedom. Back home, he was discovering that sometimes the fight for freedom wasn't in foreign lands. It was right here on American streets. And as the crowd continued to chant for his release, as cameras captured every sneer, every shove, every humiliating second, Marcus made himself a quiet promise. They may humiliate me tonight, but the truth will come. And when it does, these men will face the consequences of what they've done. The crowd was still chanting, their voices echoing across the street. Let him go, let him go. But the officers stood their ground. Marcus Johnson, wrists bound tightly behind his back, felt the sting of humiliation with every passing second. His uniform, once a symbol of honor and sacrifice, now looked like a costume in the eyes of the two men mocking him. And then in a calm, steady voice, Marcus spoke. "Officers," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone used to giving orders in chaos. "I want to make a phone call." The officers exchanged glances and chuckled. One of them leaned in, his face twisted in arrogance. "What is this, a movie? You think you get one phone call like in the films?" he sneered. The other officer laughed and added, "Who are you going to call? Your buddies? Maybe they can come rescue you." Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, his posture straight despite the cuffs digging into his wrists. "I just want one call," he repeated, his voice even. For a moment, the officers hesitated. Maybe they thought it would be entertaining to watch this soldier beg. Maybe they believed nothing could come of it. With smirks on their faces, they finally relented. One officer yanked Marcus's phone from his pocket and held it in front of him. "Go ahead, tough guy. Make your call. Let's see who saves you." The crowd grew silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. All eyes were on Marcus. His fingers, still cuffed, awkwardly tapped the screen until he found the number. Then the call went through. General Thompson speaking. The voice on the other end was deep, commanding, and unmistakably powerful. The crowd couldn't hear it clearly, but the officers could. And instantly, the smug expressions on their faces faltered. "General, Marcus said calmly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is Sergeant Marcus Johnson. I've been unlawfully detained while in uniform by 2 local officers. I need assistance immediately." There was silence for half a beat, and then the voice on the other end exploded like thunder. "What? Did you just say a decorated soldier in uniform has been handcuffed by your officers?" The crowd gasped as the officers' faces drained of color. The general's voice was so powerful. Even those standing a few feet away could hear the anger roaring through the phone. "Put him on the line right now," the general barked. The officer holding the phone fumbled nervously, glancing at his partner. His hands, which had once moved with arrogance, now shook with fear. He put the phone on speaker. "This is Officer Daniels," he stammered. Sir, we were just—" The general cut him off with the force of a hammer striking steel. "Just what? Handcuffing a U.S. Army sergeant in his full uniform? Treating a man who has bled for this country like a criminal? You listen to me. Officer, release him this instant." The crowd erupted in cheers. People shouted, clapped, and some even whistled. For the first time that night, hope flickered in their eyes. Justice, it seemed, was finally speaking up. Marcus stood tall, the corners of his mouth curling into the faintest smile. He wasn't smiling out of arrogance, but relief. Relief that the truth had a voice louder than the prejudice of the men before him. The general's voice boomed again. "I want the name and badge number of every officer involved. You've humiliated a decorated soldier in front of the public, and I promise you, this will not be swept under the rug. Do you understand me?" The officers were speechless. The crowd's cameras zoomed in closer, capturing every second of their shame. "Yes, sir," Officer Daniels finally muttered, his voice cracking. "Yes, what?" the general thundered. "Yes, General Thompson, sir," he stammered again, almost whispering the words. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Moment ago, they had been the ones mocking, sneering, and humiliating. Now they were trembling, exposed, and powerless. Marcus spoke again, his voice calm and dignified. "General, thank you. I wanted you to hear this for yourself. These men acted not out of duty, but out of prejudice." The general's reply was filled with both fury and respect. "Sergeant Johnson, I promise you this. Before the sun sets tomorrow, this matter will be handled. You have my word. For now, those cuffs will come off. Immediately." The crowd roared with approval. People began chanting Marcus's name. "Johnson, Johnson." The 2 officers, red-faced and sweating, hurried to unlock the cuffs. The metal snapped open, and Marcus's hands were finally free. He rubbed his wrist but kept his head high, his dignity intact. The general wasn't done. "Sergeant, remain calm and safe. My office will be contacting you directly within the hour. And officers, if you think this ends tonight, think again. Actions have consequences, and your careers are about to learn that the hard way." The call ended. Silence lingered for a moment, broken only by the sound of the cuffs hitting the ground. Then the crowd exploded into cheers. People hugged. Some cried. Others raised their fists in solidarity. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Marcus felt the heavy weight on his chest ease. But he knew this wasn't the end. This phone call was a turning point, the crack in the wall of injustice. What came next would shake the very foundations of the police department, maybe even the whole town. As Marcus stood there, surrounded by supporters, his uniform glowing under the neon diner lights, he made himself another promise. This humiliation may have begun with 2 men, but its ending will be remembered by the world. And all it took to spark that ending was one powerful phone call. The cuffs were off, but the weight of the injustice still hung in the air. Marcus rubbed his wrists, the red marks a painful reminder of what just happened. The crowd cheered for him, some even chanting his name, but their eyes remained locked on the 2 officers who had just been humiliated by their own arrogance. And then it happened. Within minutes of that phone call, things began to move faster than anyone could have imagined. The first sign came from the crowd itself. Dozens of people who had been recording the incident rushed to upload the videos to Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Within 15 minutes, hashtags like hashtag Justice for Sergeant Johnson and hashtag Uniform Not Crime began trending. Thousands of people across the country, many of them veterans, saw the video, their blood boiling at the sight of a soldier treated with such blatant disrespect. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly. Decorated black soldier humiliated by police officers while in uniform. One headline blared. Another simply read, "Hero handcuffed, racism exposed." By the time Marcus had walked away from the diner with his dignity intact, the entire state had already heard the story. But that was just the beginning. The very next morning, the mayor of the town called an emergency press conference. Cameras from every local station crowded the small city hall steps. The mayor's face was grim, his tone sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, what happened last night in our town is nothing short of disgraceful. A decorated soldier, an American hero, was unlawfully detained, humiliated, and disrespected by two of our own officers. Let me be clear. This is unacceptable, and it will not be tolerated." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping. But the mayor raised his hand and continued. "As of this moment, the officers involved are suspended without pay pending a full investigation. We owe Sergeant Marcus Johnson and every man and woman who wears a uniform of this nation an apology, and we will deliver justice." Those words made headlines across the country. The videos of the mayor's speech went viral too, fueling even more outrage. Veterans organizations released official statements, condemning the police department's actions. Civil rights groups called it a shocking example of systemic racism. But the strongest blow came from the military itself. General Thompson, whose voice had thundered through Marcus's phone the night before, issued a televised statement that shook the nation. Sergeant Marcus Johnson is not just a soldier. He is a hero who has served with honor and courage. The treatment he endured at the hands of law enforcement was not only unlawful, it was disgraceful. We demand accountability, and we will ensure that no soldier, no veteran, no citizen is ever treated this way again. The general's words carried weight. They weren't just a personal opinion. They were the words of one of the highest-ranking officers in the state, backed by the entire military community. The police department scrambled. Their phones were flooded with angry calls, their inboxes filled with demand for answers. Sponsors and community partners threatened to cut ties unless action was taken. Within days, the so-called internal investigation was over. The conclusion was clear. The officers had no probable cause, no justification, and had acted with bias and misconduct. The department had no choice. An official statement was released. Effective immediately, Officers Daniels and Carter are terminated from the police department. Their actions were in direct violation of department policies, community trust, and the values we are sworn to uphold. It was a short, formal statement, but its impact was explosive. The same officers who had laughed, mocked, and humiliated Marcus were now stripped of their badges, their careers in ruins. Their arrogance had turned into silence. Their power had turned into shame. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. They had tried to bring Marcus down, to humiliate him in public, to strip him of his dignity. But in the end, it was their own reputations, their own dignity, and their own livelihoods that were destroyed. Marcus didn't gloat. That wasn't who he was. When reporters asked him for his reaction, he spoke with the same calm strength he had shown the night of the arrest. "I don't take joy in seeing anyone lose their job," he said softly. "But accountability matters. Actions have consequences. I didn't wear this uniform overseas just to come home and be treated like a criminal. This is bigger than me. It's about every young man and woman watching, every veteran who's served, and every citizen who believes in justice. This fight isn't about revenge. It's about respect." His words struck a chord across the nation. They were replayed on news broadcasts, shared in viral clips, and quoted in editorials. Marcus wasn't just seen as a victim. He was seen as a leader, a voice of calm and dignity in the face of hate. Meanwhile, the two officers disappeared from the public eye. Their names were tarnished, their reputations destroyed. Wherever they went, people recognized them from the videos. Some spat at them, others called them traitors to the badge. What they thought would be a routine show of power had instead become the end of their careers. And for Marcus, justice had finally struck back. It wasn't just about two officers losing their jobs. It was about a community rising together. It was about a nation standing up and saying, "Enough is enough." The same crowd that had watched him being humiliated now watched him being vindicated. The same cameras that had recorded his pain now captured his triumph. The humiliation had been public, but so was the justice. And Marcus knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the fight for justice is not won on the battlefield. Sometimes it's won on the streets, in the court of public opinion, and in the hearts of the people who refuse to stay silent. This was one of those moments. The storm had passed, but its echoes still rippled across the nation. Marcus Johnson was no longer just a soldier returning home. He was a symbol of dignity under pressure, of strength in the face of humiliation, and of justice finally prevailing. The videos of his arrest had already reached millions, but what came after reached even further. Newspapers called him the soldier who stood tall. Social media dubbed him America's silent fighter. And to many, especially young black men and women across the country, Marcus became proof that even when dignity is stripped away, it can be reclaimed and magnified through courage. A week later, Marcus stood at a podium, his uniform pressed sharp as ever, his medals gleaming under the bright lights of a press conference. The room was packed, reporters, veterans, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had followed his story. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the stand, and the air buzzed with anticipation. When Marcus began to speak, the room fell silent. "I didn't ask to be in the spotlight," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "I didn't want to be humiliated, handcuffed, or treated like a criminal in front of my own community. But life doesn't always give us the battles we choose. Sometimes it gives us the battles we must face." He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence was powerful, the kind that demanded respect. "I've fought overseas in deserts where freedom was under fire. I've seen brothers and sisters in uniform give everything, for the flag on his shoulder," he continued, gesturing to the stars and stripes patch sewn into his sleeve. "But the hardest part of my journey wasn't what I faced abroad. It was what I faced here at home, in my own country, when two men chose to see me not as a soldier, not as a citizen, but only as the color of my skin." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Anger, agreement, heartbreak all blended together. Marcus's words were cutting, not because they were loud, but because they were true. "But let me tell you this," Marcus said firmly, his eyes sweeping across the room. "They could humiliate me in public. They could put chains on my wrists, but they could not chain my spirit. They could not take my dignity, and they could not silence the truth." The audience broke into applause, reporters scribbling frantically, cameras flashing like fireworks. And then Marcus did something unexpected. He looked directly into one of the cameras, his voice lowering, as if speaking not to the room but to every person watching from home. To every young man, every young woman watching this, especially those who look like me, don't let anyone tell you your worth is less because of the color of your skin. Don't let them strip you of your pride, your dignity, or your future. Stand tall. Even in chains, stand tall. The applause thundered louder than before, some people even standing to clap. For Marcus, this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about celebrating the downfall of the officers who had wronged him. It was about turning pain into purpose. His dignity had been tested in the harshest way possible, and instead of breaking, he had become stronger. Across the country, veterans groups rallied around him. Some invited him to speak at schools, community centers, and military bases. He received letters from soldiers overseas thanking him for showing the world what true courage looked like. Parents wrote to him, saying their children had been inspired to wear the uniform one day because of him. Even those who had never worn a uniform found inspiration. Civil rights activists saw in Marcus's calm defiance a reflection of past heroes who had stood tall in the face of injustice. Everyday citizens, from factory workers to teachers, shared his story at dinner tables, using it as a reminder that one act of dignity can ripple into a wave of change. Meanwhile, the two officers who had mocked and humiliated him faded into obscurity. They were no longer symbols of authority, but of disgrace. Their names became cautionary tales, whispered in police academies, as examples of what happens when arrogance and prejudice take the place of duty and honor. Marcus, however, continued to serve with quiet pride. He didn't let fame change him. When asked by a reporter if he now saw himself as a hero, he shook his head. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "I'm a soldier. I did what any soldier does. I stood my ground. The real heroes are the men and women who never made it back from war, who gave everything so we could live free. I just hope my story reminds people that freedom and respect must exist not just overseas, but here at home too." His humility only deepened the nation's respect for him. Months later, on Veterans Day, Marcus was invited to stand beside the governor during a ceremony honoring service members. As the American flag was raised and the national anthem played, Marcus stood at attention, his head high, his posture unshaken. And in that moment, the same community that had once watched him in chains now watched him in glory. The image of Marcus saluting the flag went viral, shared millions of times as a symbol of resilience. The caption most often written beneath it was simple: "They tried to break him. Instead, he reminded us what strength looks like." Marcus Johnson had been humiliated in front of the world, but he emerged with more than just justice. He emerged with his dignity restored, his voice amplified, and his story immortalized. And though the officers' careers ended with disgrace, Marcus's legacy had only just begun. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on the battlefield. They're won in moments of pain, turned into moments of power. And Marcus's victory, the victory of dignity over hate, was one the world would never forget.